Our bent reverse fly is a strength move for our rear delts, so the back of those shoulders, as well as our upper back. It is very similar to the movement we do in a chest fly, if you have done those, except it is standing and it is the opposite movement. So instead of pushing up and together and squeezing like we would laying on our back for a chest fly, we're doing that same movement but hinged on over and pulling back. So working the opposite muscles pretty much that we were using for those chest flies. Set up for this exercise, you're going to grab those 2 dumbbells, you're going to hinge on over to almost parallel, getting in about the same position you would for kind of like a bent over row. So legs slightly bent, back nice and straight, we're hinged over, palms are facing each other at the bottom. What we're going to do is we're going to keep that same arm position we would on a chest fly, which means just a slight bend in those arms. We're not locked straight, we're not bent up here, we have that slight bend and we're keeping that bend throughout that whole movement. I use that analogy on those chest flies. Act like you're giving somebody a big hug. That's the same thing here. You're going to come out nice and wide, keeping that same bend in those arms, and then coming back in together, nice and controlled at the bottom. Thinking about leading with those elbows coming up, squeezing that upper back and those shoulder blades together at the top. Most common mistakes made I see on this exercise, number 1, turning it into a bent over row. So instead of coming out nice and wide like this chest fly here, I'll see people bend those arms to about a 90 and come up into that kind of wide neutral grip bent over row. We want to keep that slight bend in them, that big arc as we come out here, not bending here. You're going to want lighter weights than you normally would for a bent over row or a bent over wide row because we're putting a little more focus on that rear delt, the back of the shoulder. It's a smaller muscle group than that upper back. It's not going to be able to do as much weight for these. So that's the most common mistake made. Another common mistake made I see is where you're pulling those weights back. Typically for a bent reverse fly, we're going about chest level. So those dumbbells are staying in line for the chest here. There are variations of this exercise to where we're pulling down, kind of like this, or we're pulling up, kind of up here. But for a typical bent over reverse fly, we are coming straight on out at chest level with that fly as we squeeze those shoulder blades. So using a little bit of those rear delts and a little bit of that upper back. If we are pulling more down here, we're using a little more back, a little less shoulder. If we're pulling up here, we're using a little more shoulder, a little less back. So doing that neutral position, which is what you're typically doing on a bent reverse fly, you're using a little bit of both. So focus on hinging over, back straight, legs slightly bent, arms keeping that same slight bend, leading with the elbows, getting straight on out at about chest height here at the top, and controlling this movement. Last common mistake made is swinging. I'll see people kind of grabbing way too heavy of weights and having to use that low back to get into it. Start light on this movement. Get comfortable with it. Utilize the mirror if you need to. Make sure you're performing the exercise correctly. And then as you get comfortable, start progressing up in weight.